Ah! That's right! That's right! Get up! Get up! That's what you get! Look at you! Ship all banged up! Who's the man? Huh? Who's the man? Wait till I get another plane! I'm lining all your friends up right beside you! Where you at, huh? Huh? Where you at? Welcome to Earth. That's what I call a close encounter.
In a world overflowing with movies, we need a hero. Someone to separate the bad from the good.
Sounds like a job. Verbal dioramas. Watches all the movies from comedy to drama. From the top roll sound. And don't forget the action. She'll watch until the end and then she'll give you her reaction. Movies you know, movies you don't. Prequels, sequels, remakes, and trivia and outtakes. Movies you know, movies you don't. Interesting stories, all the categories.
Hi everyone, I'm Em and welcome to Verbal Diorama episode 262, Independence Day. This is the podcast that's all about the history and legacy of movies you know and movies you don't. And as always, welcome to Verbal Diorama. Welcome if you're a brand new listener. Welcome back, regular returning listeners. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for choosing to listen to this podcast. We are here to celebrate the history and legacy of Independence Day, and I'm so happy to have you here for that. And before we go into Independence Day, which obviously is coming out on general release on Independence Day, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to everyone who listens to this podcast, has continued to listen to and continues to support this podcast. It means so much to me to have you here with me doing this podcast. It's not a particularly easy task. However, it's something that I love doing. Hopefully it's something that you think I'm reasonably decent at. And it just means so much to get all of the wonderful feedback that I do get. So thank you for your comments and your support on the most recent episodes of this podcast, on Bowfinger and on Super Mario Brothers, the two movies that I love for very different reasons, but especially Super Mario Brothers. And it's actually been really heartwarming for me to go on social media, to see people talking about Super Mario Brothers, and to actually see that there are so many other people who absolutely adore that movie for the same reasons I adore that movie, in that arguably it's not the greatest movie ever made, because as we know, that's The Mummy, but there's so much incredibly special stuff about Super Mario Brothers, and I'm so delighted that that episode has resonated with so many people who also love that movie as well. There are a lot of similarities between the making of Super Mario Brothers and the making of the movie that we're talking about in this episode. Once upon a time, Tim Burton was making an alien invasion movie. This episode is not on that movie, because that movie was Mars Attacks. Independence Day would go out of its way to gazump Mars Attacks to get released first. And this movie was originally going to be called Doomsday. And I'll be completely honest with you, I'm really glad that today we are not celebrating our Doomsday. It just sounds really ominous. Here's the trailer for Independence Day.
I think you should listen to this. This better not be another damn Russian spy job.
Away from air traffic red, say the skies are clear.
It's the real thing. A radio signal from another world.
Mr. President, our intelligence tells us the object is settled into a stationary orbit. Part of it is broken off into nearly 36 other pieces, smaller than the whole, sir. Yet over 15 miles in width themselves.
Where are they heading?
They should be entering our atmosphere within the next 25 minutes.
Let's just get there as quickly as
What's the
possible.
rush, huh? Think we'll get to Washington and won't be there?
It is confirmed. The unexplained phenomenon is headed for Moscow.
It's like a chess. First, they're positioning their pieces using this one signal to synchronize their efforts. And then what? Checkmate.
God.
I really don't think they flew 90 billion light years to start a fight.
God, I hope they bring back Elvis!
There's gonna be a lot of frightened people out there.
Yeah, I'm one of them.
Today, we celebrate our Independence Day.
Something you want to add to this briefing, Captain Hiller?
No, sir. I'm just a little anxious to get up there and whoop E.T.'s ass, that's all.
On the 2nd of July, communication systems worldwide are sent into chaos by a strange atmospheric interference. It's soon learned by the military that a number of enormous objects are on a collision course with Earth. At first thought to be meteors, they are later revealed to be gigantic spacecraft piloted by a mysterious alien species. After attempts to communicate with the aliens go nowhere, ex-scientist David Levinson discovers that aliens are going to attack major points around the globe in less than a day. On the 3rd of July, the aliens all but obliterate New York, Los Angeles, and Washington, as well as Paris, London, Houston, and Moscow. The survivors set out in convoys towards Area 51, a strange government testing ground where it's rumoured the military has captured alien spacecraft of their own. The survivors devise a plan to fight back against the aliens, and the 4th of July becomes the day humanity will fight for its freedom. Let's run through the cast. We have Will Smith as Captain Stephen Hiller, Bill Pullman as President Thomas Whitmore, Jeff Goldblum as David Levinson, Mary McDonnell as First Lady Marilyn Whitmore, Judd Hirsch as Julius Levinson, Robert Loggia as General William Gray, Randy Quaid as Russell Case, Margaret Collin as Constance Spano, Vivica A. Fox as Jasmine Dubrow, James Rebhorn as Albert Nimzicki, Harvey Fierstein as Marty Gilbert, Adam Baldwin as Major Mitchell, Brent Spiner as Dr. Brackish Oaken, Harry Connick Jr. as Marine Captain Jimmy Wilder, Mae Whitman as Patricia Whitmore, and Ross Bagley as Dylan Dubrow. Independence Day was written by Roland Emmerich and Dean Devlin and was directed by Roland Emmerich. The story of Independence Day. Well, our story starts kind of 248 years ago, when 13 British colonies on the Atlantic coast of North America started banding together in 1774 and were driving out British officials by 1775 as a result of grievances with the imperial government. They assembled at the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia, where George Washington was named the leader of the Continental Army to fight the American Revolutionary War. The delegates of the Second Continental Congress, led by the Founding Fathers, proclaimed that the 13 colonies were united, free and independent states and were no longer subject to King George III of Britain. On the 2nd of July 1776, the Congress passed the Lee Resolution in favour of independence, and 2 days later, on the 4th of July 1776, the Declaration of Independence was adopted and the United States of America was established. The 13 colonies which had been part of colonial British America were acknowledged as free, sovereign and independent states by the Treaty of Paris, which was signed in Paris on the 3rd of September 1783 by representatives of the United States and King George III. This marks the official end of the American Revolutionary War. Independence Day is one of the most well-known American holidays in the world. It's not the only Independence Day celebrated in the world. Plenty of previously colonized countries also have them, but colloquially, Independence Day is also known as the American 4th of July holiday. There is nothing more American, so I'm told, than celebrating the 4th of July. So a movie called Independence Day, released on Independence Day, was never going to be anything other than a spectacle of American patriotism and the archetypal blockbuster. It was expensive, it was lucrative, and it was bombastic. And it could have only come out in the 90s. The 80s was a time of unifications. The Berlin Wall came down and brought an end to the Cold War. The fall of communism in Europe led to the breakup of Yugoslavia and the collapse of the Soviet Union. By the mid-90s, the Gulf War was over. Nelson Mandela had put an end to apartheid after his release from prison in South Africa, and the West was becoming more affluent and positive. Capitalism was booming. Stock prices were rising, and the idea that the United States of America was the symbol of hope, freedom, and affluence was everywhere. Now, it goes without saying that only 5 years after Independence Day's release, the deadliest terrorist attacks in history occurred on US soil, and no one was blowing up national landmarks willy-nilly after that. So Independence Day really did come out at the perfect time. But even the perfect time wouldn't have worked without the perfect execution. And for that, we have Roland Emmerich and Dean Devlin to thank. In the previous episode on Super Mario Bros., I referenced Godzilla 1998. And this episode also follows that trend because Emmerich and Devlin, last featured on episode 211, which is Godzilla, they are also the writers of Godzilla. Emmerich directed Godzilla. But Independence Day was a lot more straightforward to make than Godzilla was. Emmerich and Devlin had just made Stargate, and they recalled the origins of Independence Day a little differently from each other. Roland Emmerich met with Warner Brothers executives to talk about a prison escape movie starring Harrison Ford, not believed to be The Rock, which was never a Warner Brothers movie, but similarly to The Rock, was budgeted for $70 million. Emmerich left the meeting thinking that $70 million could get you an alien invasion movie. He bought a copy of War of the Worlds, went to Dean Devlin, and suggested he knew what their next movie was going to be. Dean Devlin recalls it differently. At a Stargate press junket, the pair were asked whether they believed the aliens built the pyramids, to which they said no, but Emmerich suggested it would be the most exciting day ever if 14-mile wide spaceships cover the sky. I'm not sure exciting is the word to use, Roland, but okay, you do you. It was then that he apparently suggested to Dean Devlin he knew what their next movie was going to be. Flying saucers and aliens hiding in small provincial towns would be out. These would be huge ships, as big as cities. It would pay homage to The Day the Earth Stood Still, The War of the Worlds, and the 70s disaster movies like The Towering Inferno, Airport, and The Poseidon Adventure. This would be a movie for the people who loved Star Wars, wanted those shots of ships flying slowly through space, and those who grew up loving Spielberg movies too. However, they got to that point. The general consensus was they wanted to do an alien invasion movie, and surely no one else was doing one at the same time. Well, no one apart from Tim Burton. His movie, Mars Attacks, had been in development for over 10 years by this point and was due out in August 1996. So Emmerich and Devlin decided their movie would beat Mars Attacks to the punch. In fact, the whole concept of Independence Day and the 4th of July was so they could release it the month before Mars Attacks. As Emmerich would state in an interview with The Guardian in 2016, quote, "I told our agent we wanted to do it, and he said forget about it. Tim Burton is doing Mars Attacks. I said to Dean, we can't do our film after a parody comes out. We had to beat him to it. If it came out on the 4th of July weekend, we would beat Mars Attacks, which was coming out in August. So we wrote the concept around the release date," unquote. Emmerich and Devlin holed up in a rented house in Mexico to write their script and devise the storyboards. They spent their downtime watching those 70s disaster movies. 3.5 weeks later, the script was finished, and they sent the script to their agent, Michael Weimer. Immediately, it was up for auction. They met with all 9 major studios, and all 9 major studios wanted it. All of them put in bids. They included in the meetings the ad campaign they wanted to use, which studios also had to agree to. It came to a head between Universal and 20th Century Fox. Fox executives questioned them wanting to blow up the White House. Emmerich and Devlin countered that audiences would love the idea of space aliens blowing up one of America's most well-known landmarks, Again, this was before the biggest terrorist attack the US had ever seen. Post 9/11, this would never have been done. That didn't mean it wasn't seen as insensitive. On the 19th of April 1995, anti-government extremists detonated a bomb in front of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, killing over 150 people. That wasn't done by extraterrestrials wanting to take over Earth, though. And this was the thing that Emmerich and Devlin always came back to. That night, Fox won the bidding war. Emmerich would have final cut, and it promised to pay them a salary of $7.5 million plus a percentage of the profits, gave them a $69 million production budget, and a 14-month production schedule leading up to a 2nd of July 1996 release. Emmerich and Devlin would continue to work on the script, but in the event of disagreement, the existing script would stand. Marketing the movie was something that they thought about right from the very start, though. They'd struggled with Stargate because that film had a different distributor in every country. Some marketed it the way Emmerich and Devlin wanted it to be marketed, and others didn't. Where the marketing was to their liking, Stargate had done well, so they decided they wanted to be in control of these elements. And I'm going to come back to marketing a bit later, but not making the same mistakes again was really important. The script was now called Independence Day. Pre-production began 3 days after Fox won the bidding for the script in February 1995, and it would have to be a quick production. This was because Emmerich was adamant that a spoof comedy alien invasion could not come out before his super serious alien invasion. The movie had to come out on Independence Day 1996. Bill Mechanic, the new boss of Fox, suggested Memorial Day as a good alternative because Independence Day just wasn't working as a title or a release date. But Emmerich stood firm. Independence Day was coming out on Independence Day. But it wasn't technically called Independence Day officially at the time. The rights to the name Independence Day were owned by Warner Brothers, who had another movie called Independence Day, a little-known 1983 drama starring Kathleen Quinlan and David Keith. Up until that point, it was referred to as ID4, a name that stuck throughout marketing and beyond. Doomsday was still being considered as a viable release title, but to win the rights to use the name would need something epic, something impactful. A speech, maybe. I'll come back to that as well. Just like on Godzilla, Emmerich and Devlin had a huge amount of creative control on Independence Day, which meant they had an incredible amount of sway too with studio decisions. Casting was one such thing they had a say on, but not the final say. It seems ridiculous now, even post-Oscars slap, that anyone in Hollywood believed Will Smith couldn't open a movie, but Fox truly believed Smith wouldn't work. The reasons being he was a fairly unproven actor, he'd starred in 6 Degrees of Separation, but was mostly known for being the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. Bad Boys hadn't yet come out at this point, and rather shamefully for Fox, they didn't like the fact that he was black. They thought having a black lead actor would kill foreign box office. Roland Emmerich, though, knew Will Smith was his guy. He argued Smith's case that this was a movie about space aliens. Additionally, the whole thing was about the world coming together to fight. That includes black and brown people, unsurprisingly. Ethan Hawke was also on the list, but Emmerich thought he was too young. He really wanted Will Smith, and he wanted Jeff Goldblum as well. Dean Devlin would tell Variety in 1999 that they wanted an all-American boy to play Stephen Hiller, and that Will Smith was the all-American boy, and that, quote, "This guy has lived the American dream more than anyone I know," unquote. Jeff Goldblum was, of course, riding high off the success of Jurassic Park before being the lead in its sequel, The Lost World, both previous episodes of this podcast, just FYI, and in all of those movies as well, being the smartest character on screen. The fact that the two main heroes in this movie are played by Jeff Goldblum, a Jewish American man, and Will Smith, an African American man, two races of people so heavily oppressed in recent memory and throughout the history of America itself. That fact is not lost on many people, and Roland Emmerich made this intentional. So much was his intention to have Will Smith and Jeff Goldblum that he threatened he'd take his project to a different studio unless Fox acquiesced to the casting. Maybe old white studio executives just don't know everything, because Smith and Goldblum's chemistry together would be cinematic dynamite. Obviously, Fox knew that they had something special, and they eventually agreed, and it only led to Will Smith becoming one of the biggest box office stars of the late 90s and early 2000s, so no big deal for his career. Bill Pullman got a call from his agent asking if he'd like to play the president in a Fox movie. Pullman originally thought it was a comedy because presidential roles were usually biopics, but then found out it was science fiction. And I'm going to come back to his rousing speech later, because that did more for the movie than just rally the troops. But Pullman wasn't the first choice for President Whitmore. The first choice was actually Kevin Spacey. One of the earliest ideas for the movie was to have a villainous president who eventually becomes a hero when he jumps in the plane to fight the alien invaders, and Dean Devlin had known Kevin Spacey since high school. After seeing him in The Usual Suspects, they pushed the studio to hire Spacey, knowing he was about to hit big and to get him while he was cheap and hadn't won an Oscar yet. One studio executive scoffed at the idea that Spacey would ever win an Oscar. He did, in 1995, for The Usual Suspects. Once the decision was made to go with Pullman, the character became much more likeable. A president who used to be a fighter pilot, but is seen as a weak politician. It's hard to imagine some previous presidents being willing to jump in a fighter jet to take on alien hordes, especially the one who got out of being drafted into Vietnam. At the time, Vivica A. Fox was starring in US soap The Young and the Restless. But now an African-American man was leading the movie. Casting agents were looking for an African-American woman to play his girlfriend. Fox had starred with Smith on The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air in a small role as Jazzy Jeff's sister. Her agent didn't think she was a big enough name to audition, but 2 weeks later, the Independence Day team came calling wanting to speak to Fox. Executive producer William Fay's wife was a huge fan of The Young and the Restless and recommended they audition Vivica A. Fox for the part. Fox auditioned 6 times, the first time in a tight white leather jumpsuit with high heels and full makeup, because she knew she was auditioning to play a stripper. But Wendy Kurtzman, the casting director, wanted more of a girl next door than a stripper and recommended Fox watch Speed and see how Sandra Bullock dressed. Fox changed her outfit, bought a cute feminine dress, boots and ankle socks, and went back for another audition, and she got the job. Connections to The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air would also lead to Ross Bagley getting the role of Jasmine's young son Dylan. Bagley played the youngest member of the Banks family, Nikki Banks, so he'd already worked with Will Smith. Filming would begin in July 1995 in New York City, with a press release from Fox heralding the day as the countdown to the end of the world. And this was a movie with a lot of filming on location, including in Arizona and at the Carl G. Jansky Very Large Array Radio Astronomy Site in New Mexico, then just called the Very Large Array, which comprises 28 25-meter radio telescopes, 27 of which are operational, while one is always rotating through maintenance. The VLA allows investigations of many astronomical objects, including radio galaxies, quasars, pulsars, supernova remnants, gamma-ray bursts, radio-emitting stars, the sun and planets, astrophysical masers, black holes, and the hydrogen gas that constitutes a large portion of the Milky Way galaxy, as well as external galaxies. Filming then moved to the border of Utah and Nevada, the Bonneville Salt Flats, and a little town called Wendover, with cheap hotel rooms and casinos, plus an airport for the exterior El Toro and Area 51 scenes. And of course, this was the middle of the summer. It was atrociously hot, 123 degrees Fahrenheit, that's 50 degrees Celsius. So this was hot, Keanu Reeves levels of hot. They had tents up for shade, but it was still hot. Rehearsal would take place with stand-ins, and there's a great story of Will Smith, how the first thing they shot was the ending scene. He walked out of his tent, excused his stand-in, and rehearsed in the heat. And one by one, all of the other actors did exactly the same thing. This was a genuine team of people who worked together, no airs and graces, no egos, just a bunch of actors rehearsing together, and through this camaraderie came genuine friendships. While their scenes together wouldn't amount to much except the third act, Smith and Goldblum had a natural rapport, which meant many of their scenes together were improvised. Devlin would suggest words to throw in and suggested Goldblum reuse his "must go faster" line from Jurassic Park, thinking it would likely get cut because they were doing so many takes with so many great improvised lines. But it wasn't cut, and luckily Steven Spielberg was okay with them recycling the line. Mostly, though, it was just Smith and Goldblum having a great time. The hard part was choosing which improv lines were the best ones, with Emmerich often mixing and matching the best takes with the best lines. Speaking of the best lines, we really need to talk about that speech, because the speech in this movie was vital to this movie. Dean Devlin wrote the speech originally as a temporary insertion that they'd work more on later. And as the script never really changed all that much from the initial version, no one realised that the temporary speech had never been updated or rewritten until they were literally about to shoot the scene. It was 2 a.m, Bill Pullman was rehearsing, everyone was tired, they needed something to rouse the crowd. They were getting ready to shoot it, so Dean Devlin raced to the set to rewrite it. And then he heard Pullman rehearsing, saw the extras' reactions to it, and the speech was great. It didn't need rewriting. Pullman suggested a hitch in the beginning to get the crowd's attention, which turned out to be mic trouble. It gave Whitmore that additional level of humanity and fallibility. Pullman based his delivery on Robert F. Kennedy's speech, given minutes after he found out about Martin Luther King's assassination. Kennedy's sincerity and composure without any preparation was masterful. This was the vibe he wanted for President Whitmore's speech. But the issue in the studio over the title of the movie remained, because the studio still wanted to call the movie Doomsday. Emmerich and Devlin hated that title, so they decided to cement the title that they wanted. So this incredible speech, that was never changed from that initial version, was changed ever so slightly. The last line, and the only line that was ever changed in that temporary speech, was changed by Devlin to say, "Today we celebrate our Independence Day." A day or two later, they took the dailies from that filming session on VHS tape, obviously, to Fox, to make a case for the title to stay Independence Day. And it worked. Doomsday was no more. The title would instead be symbolic and uplifting, rather than completely ominous and terrifying. They managed to make a deal with Warner Brothers for the title Independence Day, and the rest is history. But this podcast would not be this podcast without talking about the visual effects on Independence Day, because they are still lauded as some of the best visual effects ever put to screen. The Guinness World Record this movie has for the most miniature model work to appear in one film will likely never be beaten due to the advancements in CG effects. The visual effects were entrusted to production visual effects supervisor Volker Engel, whose job it was to find visual effects houses to work on the various key scenes. And the scope of the project was initially hard to determine because the screenplay would reference landmarks blowing up, but the scaling of those models and the work involved to actually do it, those early stages, ignorance was kind of bliss. It wasn't until a lunch between the effects team where they were discussing the shooting schedule did they realise the scale of the task in hand. Engel would say to the Hollywood Reporter, quote, "We were discussing the shooting schedule for the coming week, which sounded like, are we blowing up the Capitol on Wednesday and White House on Friday, or was that Thursday? Only then we realised that the guests at the other table had stopped eating and were staring at us. It was all very surreal," unquote. Approximately 4,000 distinct scale model elements and tabletop miniatures were shot by Volker Engel and Doug Smith, the co-supervisor of visual effects. Without the usual digital pre-visualization tools of today, it had to be carefully planned. Instead, they had a project management database and storyboards created by Mark Weigert, Engel's business partner. With up to 4 camera crews working in tandem, the miniatures took 9 months to shoot. Patriotism also returns to this episode. He was also in the last episode of Super Mario Bros. And also the previous episode I mentioned, Godzilla. And his alien designs were both unique and revolutionary. You still get the typical looking alien creature, reminiscent of 1950s UFO stories, but you also get a biomechanical exoskeleton, itself very similar to that shown in Guyver. Emmerich liked both of these designs, so why not both? Like a Russian doll, the alien survives inside the exoskeleton. The aliens themselves are brought to life as an 8-foot-tall cable puppet and a suit designed to be worn by a stunt performer for scenes where the alien interacts with humans. These suits were 8 feet tall, equipped with 25 tentacles, and were purposely designed to show it could not sustain a person inside, so it would not appear to be a man in a suit. Many of the visual effects shots were filmed at Hughes Aircraft in Culver City, California. The model-making department of the production created the miniatures for buildings, city streets, aeroplanes, landmarks, and monuments, and as a result produced more than twice as many miniatures for the production than had ever been created for any previous film. In addition, the crew constructed miniatures of several of the spaceships that are shown in the movie, such as a 12-foot mothership and a 30-foot destroyer model. Entire city streets were replicated in miniature and then tipped vertically under a fast-moving camera fixed atop a scaffold, capturing footage as it descended down the model. An explosion would be set off beneath the model, and the flames would rise towards the camera. The vertical model would be engulfed in flame, creating the rolling wall of destruction effect seen in the movie. For the infamous White House explosion scene, they got mechanical effects supervisor, the late Joe Viscasil, a miniature pyro expert, and uncredited pyrotechnics supervisor on this movie, who previously worked in pyrotechnics on such movies as Terminator 2 Judgment Day. He's been previously mentioned on this podcast in Godzilla, unsurprisingly, and also Team America World Police for his special effects work. He also blew up the Death Star in Star Wars Episode 4 A New Hope. For 3.5 months, Viscasil did nothing but shoot explosions. He built up a library of fire and flame that was the most extensive ever created, because blowing up a miniature White House was always going to be a one and done, so everything was rigorously tested beforehand. 95% of the visual effects in the movie were using miniatures with motion-control cameras and combined digitally in post-production. This movie was right on the cusp of the digital revolution. The White House model was 15 feet wide and 5 feet high. It had a plaster shell attached to a metal body with individual floors, including furniture and other details on the inside. The model was so detailed, holding up in extreme close-ups, that it became very dear to people's hearts on set, so much so that they almost didn't want to blow it up. The scene was shot with 9 cameras at 300 frames per second, in order to capture the destruction in a way that looks so much more dramatic than the 1-second explosion that occurred in real time would lead you to believe. And in a stark contrast to the visual effects world of today, which is usually shrouded in secrecy and involves NDAs, the press were actually invited to watch the White House blow up. 20th Century Fox invited about 50 members of the press to witness the explosion live as they filmed it. The night before, they'd rehearsed with a smaller piece of the White House wall to get the timing of the pyro charges correct. And because this was the money shot of the movie, the shot they'd use in promotional material, the shot that would glue audiences to their seats, not only did the press show up, everyone involved showed up to watch. And that one take, that one explosion, was literally witnessed by everyone and their dog. And that is that one explosion in the movie. It is remarkable. Independence Day wasn't just miniature models though, it was also CG effects for alien shields, lasers and the mothership explosion, as well as models for the F-18 fighter jets and alien attack ships. These were done by Visual Arts using their in-house sprite renderer Sparky. For Independence Day, Sparky required extensive enhancements to deliver the hundreds of ships dogfighting in the sky. The graphics buffers only had 1024 pixels across, so they had to tile the rendering into 4 tiles and stitch the buffers back together on the disc to render the 2K frames for the film. Visual Arts came to the project fairly late, so only had a limited amount of time to finish the visual effects for Independence Day. Test screenings would prove vital to the end of the movie though. Apparently having the aliens win just wasn't going to work. I'm kidding. Peter Chernin, the head of Fox at the time, thought the movie was too long and it needed some scenes cutting. But no one could decide what to cut, so they decided to play it for a secret test audience in Arizona. The test screening didn't start very well. The projection was so bad that in the first shot, which starts on the plaque on the moon and tilts up to the spaceship, was so dark that you couldn't actually see the spaceship. But the audience still loved the movie and it tested incredibly highly, in the low 90s, except for one thing: Russell Case. Originally, Russell Case flies in his crop duster, with a bomb roped to his plane in the final aerial battle. The test audience thought it was unrealistic and took the audience away from the ultra-serious moment. As I mentioned, very little was changed from that initial script, but one thing that was Russell Case's sacrifice. Originally, Case was in an F-16, and it was changed after Jeff Oken, the visual effects supervisor on Stargate and the namesake and reference model for Brackish Oken, read the script and said Randy Quaid should use his crop duster to fly up there. So Emmerich and Devlin changed the scene and shot Randy Quaid in a crop duster. But after the feedback from the test audience, they realised they needed to do reshoots. Fox didn't want to pay for reshoots, but they eventually acquiesced. One day of reshoots happened 2 weeks before the movie debuted, including some additional backstory for Russell Case. They also managed to reuse some footage from the Empire State Building scene for Case's sacrificial journey into the destroyer's big beam. The Empire State Building had been blown up from top to bottom in the other shot, so they turned that on its head and layered that over this cannon and reused it, this time from bottom to top. The movie was retested in Las Vegas with Emmerich and Devlin in attendance at a secret screening, and audiences erupted when they realised it was Independence Day. Despite technical problems in the screening, the audience was sold. It scored 98. 5 days before release, it was finished and shipped to theatres. In the mail, of course, because this was before the internet. But why was the audience so excited when they realised it was a secret screening of Independence Day? Well, I'm going to come back to the marketing of this movie, but the marketing of this movie was absolutely crucial to the success of Independence Day. Segueing into something crucial to the success of this podcast, it is time for the obligatory Keanu reference of this episode. And if you want to know what that is, well, it's where I try and link the movie that I'm featuring with Keanu Reeves, because Keanu Reeves is the best of men, and all men should be attempting in their life to be a little bit more like Keanu Reeves. And there are actually several ways I could link Keanu to Independence Day, but the most obvious way is just to reiterate the fact that Vivica A. Fox was told to dress more like Sandra Bullock in Speed. Sandra Bullock co-starred in Speed with Keanu Reeves. David Arnold returned to working with director Roland Emmerich for his score for Independence Day. They both worked together on Stargate. They would go on to work together on Godzilla as well. Arnold would go on to win a Grammy for the score, for which he gathered every last ounce of stereotypical Americana for. Arnold is British, by the way. There's also a small scene in this movie where R.E.M.'s Is the End of the World as We Know It ironically plays in the background, but otherwise the music in this movie is very deliberately American patriotism on steroids. Undoubtedly, the biggest marketing opportunity for your tentpole summer blockbuster is an advertisement at the Super Bowl. Back in the 90s, they didn't advertise movies at the Super Bowl, but Fox had agreed to this movie Independence Day coming out around Independence Day, and they were nervous about the 4th of July release due to the impending Olympic Games. You don't want to release your huge blockbuster literally the week before the Olympics. It was also the 100th anniversary of the inaugural 1896 Summer Olympics in Athens. The 1996 Olympic Games in Atlanta opened on the 19th of July 1996, and obviously sport is big business. So how do you fight against a huge global sporting event? You do it with a huge global sporting event. The Fox marketing department went into overdrive, paying $1.3 million to run a trailer during Super Bowl Sunday in January 1996. But there was still a worry about using the White House explosion footage as the Super Bowl trailer. So they tested 2 ads, one with the White House and one without. The Fox executives went crazy for the White House footage. It was a risk, but it was the one they were going to go with. That risk paid off. The spectacle worked. The 1-minute, 11-second official teaser of the darkness falling over American cities and landmarks, culminating in the White House exploding, sent viewers into overdrive. This was a viral event before events went viral. Everyone was talking about Independence Day, despite it not coming out for another 6 months. Following a press junket in New York in June 1996, Dean Devlin received a surprising phone call. The White House, not the one they blew up, the real one, made a request for President Bill Clinton to have his own special private screening of Independence Day at the White House, which included Emmerich, Devlin, and Bill Pullman, which culminated in a tour of the White House. Again, not the one they blew up, the real White House. President Clinton would declare to a gathering in Youngstown, Ohio, on the opening weekend of Independence Day, quote, "Someone said I was coming to Youngstown because this is the day the White House gets blown away by space aliens. I hope it's there when I get back," unquote. Clinton's rival in 1996's presidential election, Senator Bob Dole, would also attempt to borrow the film's imagery as well as one of its taglines for a talking point on his campaign trail, quote, "For far too long, President Clinton's economic policies have hovered like an alien ship over the American economy, blowing away growth and opportunity. In 1996, America strikes back," unquote. Clinton won re-election in 1996, just FYI. Fox would also strike promotional agreements with Apple, resulting in product placement featuring Goldblum's character using a PowerBook 5300 equipped with a staggeringly powerful 100 MHz processor and an incredible 64 megabytes of RAM to insert a virus into alien hardware. Less than a month after its remarkable success and the PowerBook's newfound status as the savior of humanity, Apple discontinued the PowerBook 5300 on the 3rd of August 1996. Other product placement deals were booked with Coors and Coca-Cola, and tie-in toys were developed. Teaser trailers and slogans like "Don't make plans for August" permeated popular culture. And before the film was released, a half-hour special about the movie that included what could have been considered a fake news report on the movie's alien invasion premise aired on Fox the weekend before Independence Day. 1996 was the summer of Twister, Mission Impossible, The Rock, The Nutty Professor, A Time to Kill, Eraser, and The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Independence Day had its work cut out for it. Its premiere took place not at the Clinton White House, but at the Mann Plaza Theatre in Los Angeles on the 25th of June 1996. It was released wide on the 2nd of July 1996, the day before it was originally scheduled to open. Independence Day went straight to number one that first week, beating The Nutty Professor by a few $1 million. It stayed at number one for 4 weeks before being dethroned by A Time to Kill. It would move around the top 10, but it would stay in there for 17 weeks, returning back to the top 10 in its 21st week. It stayed in the top 20 of the US box office for 25 weeks. When Jaws broke box office records and thrilled audiences to the point where they kept going back to the theatres to see the film again and again in 1975, the word blockbuster was officially adopted into Hollywood slang. The following decade saw the release of a number of big-budget studio productions that would go on to become definitive summer blockbusters. Star Wars, E.T. the Extraterrestrial, they came out in the months of May and June respectively. Following this trend, Hollywood quickly adopted the summer blockbuster as their tentpole feature. In 1993, almost 2 decades after the release of Jaws, Jurassic Park would emerge as the most successful movie of all time and the definitive summer blockbuster. Jurassic Park's record wouldn't stand for long before an opponent emerged, though. On its $75 million budget, Independence Day grossed $306.1 million domestically and $511.3 million internationally, for a total worldwide gross of $817.4 million. For a short while before the Lost World Jurassic Park came out in 1997, Independence Day was the second highest grossing movie of all time. It also came very close to beating the record set by Jurassic Park during its first week of release. Independence Day went above and beyond almost everyone's expectations, surpassing films like Twister and Mission Impossible to become the highest grossing film of 1996. Fox would also sink another $30 million into another marketing campaign for the movie's eventual VHS release, which coincided with Thanksgiving. On Rotten Tomatoes, Independence Day has a score of 68%, with the site's critical consensus reading, "The plot is thin and so is character development, but as a thrilling, spectacle-filled summer movie, Independence Day delivers." Most critics agreed that this was not a movie for character development or great dialogue, It was all about the spectacle. You could very easily critique the science, and many have. The virus infecting the aliens being the most obvious question. The virus was written on a power book, but David Levinson reverse engineered how the aliens were targeting our own satellites and using them against us. And once he'd found out their own command protocol structure, he uploaded the virus into their systems using the same channels. We're also assuming that an intelligent alien species hadn't updated their own technology for over 50 years. Maybe on their planet, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. We had a ship in Area 51 for 50 years and it still worked and communicated with the alien tech. But, since when do we scientifically analyse fun, schlocky blockbusters? Actually, scratch that. Loads of people do it. Independence Day would go on to be nominated for an Academy Award for Best Sound and would win an Academy Award for Best Visual Effects, as well as winning the aforementioned Grammy for the score. A BBC radio audio drama produced by Dirk Maggs in conjunction with 20th Century Fox would air on BBC Radio on the 4th of August 1996 called Independence Day UK. Now, we wouldn't get the movie in the UK until the 9th of August. Maggs was given permission to produce an original version on the condition he did not reveal certain details of the movie's plot and that the British were not depicted as saving the day, obviously. In it, he would pay homage to Orson Welles' The War of the Worlds, with the first half of the audio drama playing out as a genuine Radio 1 broadcast called UFO Watch, where the first 20 minutes were live. In it, UFOs are flying high over the skies of the UK, and the broadcast plays out audio from the mysterious aircraft. Starring in the radio play was previous Doctor Who Colin Baker as RAF Group Captain Phil Johnson. As the alien craft unleashes its deadly laser weapon on London, just like in the movie, a reporter describes the impact of the extraterrestrial weapon on the London skyline while he watches from the roof of BBC Broadcasting House. When the enormous wall of flames reach the reporter's position, the audio abruptly ends and is completely silent. Due to the fact the movie hadn't yet reached us, the radio play was spoiler-free, but it does manage to make a little dig at the Americans taking the credit. Some people thought that this BBC radio play was genuine, and the BBC received phone calls as to its authenticity. Independence Day UK was only ever broadcast that one time, but you can find it on the internet and it is also in podcast form. Now, there is an official sequel to this movie. Dean Devlin and Roland Emmerich wrote a treatment for 2 sequels to create a trilogy, which they confirmed in June 2011. Talks about Will Smith returning were put on hold in October 2011 because Fox refused his $50 million salary for both films. ID Forever Part 1 and ID Forever Part 2 were announced by Roland Emmerich in March 2013. 20th Century Fox approved a single standalone sequel in November 2014, and that was scheduled for release in June 2016. Emmerich announced the title Independence Day Resurgence in June 2015. Will Smith declined to return to the franchise, but Jeff Goldblum reprised his original role, as did Bill Pullman, Judd Hirsch, Brent Spiner, and Vivica A. Fox. On the 24th of June 2016, Independence Day Resurgence was released. It was a critical and financial failure, making more sequels highly unlikely, and Independence Day 3 has never materialised. An episode on Independence Day that comes out on Independence Day is not really unique. I expect many podcasts will be celebrating Independence Day on Independence Day. But this movie has such a unique place in cinematic history, so much that it paid homage to, so much that it went on to inspire, and yet it never seems to be in the same conversations as Jaws or Jurassic Park, but what it did actually do for cinema. It's firmly planted in its B-movie roots, while also being one of the biggest movies of all time. Roland Emmerich is not really seen as a cinematic auteur, because he followed this with Godzilla, an underrated gem, might I add. Please listen to my episode on that as to why. But he'd mostly be known for his disaster movies going forward. The Day After Tomorrow, 2012, and Moonfall, each of them having key landmarks being destroyed, or humanity saving the day in unlikely ways, or just the deaths of millions of people willy-nilly. Independence Day is a little blasé in how it destroys civilization in most of the world's key cities at the exact same time. But hey, at least the dog survives in his movies because that's important. The success of Independence Day led to a resurgence, no pun intended, of the disaster movie genre, with films like Dante's Peak, Volcano, Titanic, Deep Impact, and Armageddon getting released within 2 years. Criticisms on its place as American propaganda still permeate, mostly due to its title, and regardless of what the intention was, it's still very much placed as Americans coming together to save the world. The rest of the world is still very much in the background asking, well, what do the Americans want us to do? And well done, chaps. It is important that people of all racial and ethnic backgrounds unite and celebrate their victory over this global threat. But each of those individuals we get to know is an American. America remains the unifying force in this film, much like it does in real life, acting independently and giving little thought to the effects on others. Despite its German director, this feels very much like a film by Americans for Americans. And this is perhaps why, for this little British podcaster, Independence Day just doesn't hit like it did in 1996. That doesn't mean it's not deserving of its place in blockbuster cinema history. It was perfectly timed, perfectly executed, and gave the world what it needed. Will Smith, I'm kidding, but I'm also not, because Will Smith became a megastar off this movie. The 90s was a defining period of time, but also hard to believe that only 30 years ago, Roland Emmerich had to tackle studio racism to get Will Smith cast. We've come a long way in 30 years, but still not far enough. But really, we're all here for the practical effects, and this movie delights in making them the centerpieces. I will say, though, that with 9/11 still so recent in many of our memories, it does feel a little jarring to try and find enjoyment in this recognisable and incredibly realistic destruction. After 9/11, several of the crew, including Joe Viscasil and Dean Devlin, expressed their horror that the imagery in Independence Day was so similar to the real-life scenes of the attacks on the Twin Towers and at the Pentagon. Devlin would say in an interview with IGN, quote, "After September the 11th, there were a lot of interviews that Roland and I did, basically because the imagery looked so similar, and it was so frightening to see things that were fantasy in a movie look so much like these horrible images of reality. As we were doing interviews about it, we were actually saying that the more interesting parallel of Independence Day was how the world came together in the aftermath of 9/11, how people who had been arguing stopped arguing and started working together," unquote. Independence Day is rooted in 90s nostalgia. It is a monument to American popular culture of the 1990s, both in terms of ideology and the choices made for its plot, casting, and acting. From its use of scale models to the Apple computer internet virus that has the power to destroy the spaceship of an advanced alien life form. It is the king of dumb sci-fi movies, and sometimes that's all you need a movie to be. Happy 4th of July, American listeners. Today, we celebrate this Independence Day. Thank you for listening. As always, I would love to hear your thoughts on Independence Day. And as always, thank you for your continued support of this podcast. Please take a moment to get involved, help this podcast grow, spread the word, tell family and friends about this podcast, leave a rating or review wherever you found this podcast. Ideally, 5 stars would be amazing. If you want to get in touch with me and you want to talk about Independence Day or any other episode that I've ever done on this podcast, actually, you can find me on social media. I am at Verbal Diorama on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, and Letterboxd. And if you like this episode on Independence Day, you might also like the following movies/episodes. I've got to recommend episode 162, Mars Attacks, because as a parallel movie to this one, the story of Mars Attacks is just as impressive, just as interesting, and the movie might not have done as well as Independence Day, but it is a super fun movie that definitely deserves your time and attention. Please listen to that episode. Please watch that movie. It's great. Also, episode 158, Team America World Police, because America, F yeah. Obviously, episode 211, Godzilla, 1998. I mentioned Godzilla several times. It is a movie I'm very fond of and have a lot of time for. I don't think it's a great movie, but I do think it's a fun movie. And episode 213, Pacific Rim, because if you want a good rousing speech, Pacific Rim also delivers in that aspect. And it's also a great movie. It's got kaiju and Jaegers fighting each other. Who doesn't want that? As always, give me feedback. Let me know what you think of my recommendations. So the next episode, I want to answer the eternal question of how many passports is too many passports? Who is John Michael Caine? Who is Jason Bourne? What is Treadstone? And how dare Doug Liman and Matt Damon come together to make the definitive early 2000s action thriller with gritty realism and genuine heart as well? The next episode of Verbal Diorama is on the history and legacy of the Bourne identity. I am really looking forward to going into the history and legacy of this movie because I love the Bourne movies. And I love that the Bourne identity was really the start of the big budget action blockbuster that had brains as well as tension-filled moments and characters with this genuine chemistry. And also some really great fight scenes as well. Fight choreography is something that I love to talk about in movies. I always refer to Atomic Blonde when it comes to great fight choreography. But the Bourne identity has some of the best fight choreography that's pretty much ever been seen in cinema, with every punch weighted in drama and consequence. So join me next week for the history and legacy of the Bourne identity. Now, I always say this podcast is free and it always will be free. You are under no obligation to pay me any money for this podcast. However, if you get value out of what I do, and if you want to support an indie podcaster who basically does all of this on her own, and you have some spare change, then you can support this podcast. There are a couple of ways you can do it. You could go to verbaldiorama.com/tips and you can give a one-off tip. Or you could go to verbaldiorama.com/Patreon and you can join the amazing patrons of this podcast. They are Simon E, Sade, Claudia, Simon B, Laurel, Derek, Kat, Andy, Mike, Luke, Michael, Scott, Brendan, Lisa, Sam, Jack, Dave, Stuart, Nicholas, So, Kev, Pete, Heather, Danny, Ali, Stu, Brett, Philip, Michelle, Zenos, Sean, Rhino and Russell. If you don't want to get in touch with me, you can email verbaldiorama@gmail.com or you can go to my website, verbaldiorama.com. You can also find bits that I do at filmstories.co.uk as well. And finally,
Morning.
They're a little young.
That they are.
They look a little nervous.
All right, I need all flight crews to report to their designated areas immediately.
Major. Roland. Sir.
Good morning. Good morning. In less than an hour, aircraft from here will join others from around the world. And you will be launching the largest aerial battle in the history of mankind. Mankind, that word should have new meaning for all of us today. We can't be consumed by our petty differences anymore. We will be united in our common interest. Perhaps it's fate that today is the 4th of July. And you will once again be fighting for our freedom. Not from tyranny, oppression, or persecution, but from annihilation. We're fighting for our right to live, to exist. And should we win the day, the 4th of July will no longer be known as an American holiday, but as the day when the world declared in one voice, we will not go quietly into the night. We will not vanish without a fight. We're going to live on. We're going to survive. Today, we celebrate our Independence Day.